In the weeks leading up to Christmas, we are caught in a mood of anticipation. We anticipate visits from family, a festive meal, and presents to be opened. We also look forward to the celebration of the incarnation of a god in human flesh, whose death brings about one of the greatest ghost stories ever told. Rephrased, the story of Christmas is already a kind of horror narrative. While images of Christmas are often drenched in cozy lights, flickering fires, and unending rounds of joyful sing-along tunes, it has not escaped the long grasp of horror. If nothing else, horror is good at making that which seems safe feel unsafe. It takes our most precious ideas and turns them on their heads, revealing all that is hidden underneath. That here includes the cost and devaluation of labor, the drudgery of infinite consumption, and a sense of loneliness highlighted by flickering neon pictures of grotesquely smiling families.
In this episode of Horror Joy, we take a sled ride into the horror of the holidays. We begin with a short story by Algernon Blackwood titled The Kit Bag. While not explicitly a Christmas story, it highlights the tension built in anticipation during Advent, a perverted Santa's sack, and a vacation that never arrives. We then turn to Bob Clark's 1974 holiday classic Black Christmas, widely considered one of the first slasher films. It sets the stage for future iterations, including Halloween and Scream, by targeting young women, vilifying mental illness, and offering an early version of the final girl. So, grab your favorite ugly sweater and join us for a joyful dash through the dark pine fields of an inverted Christmas tale. Make sure to plug in your lights. We'll need them to keep the darkness away and to make our Yuletide gay. Come for the horror, stay for the joy. This is Horror Joy. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi.
And I'm Jeff Stoyanoff. We're two professors celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. Okay, Brian, so Merry Christmas, everyone, for those of you that celebrate. We are here with our Christmas episode of Horror Joy, looking at the short story Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood, and then Bob Clark's 74 holiday classic, Black Christmas. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about Algernon Blackwood's The Kit Bag, which, Brian, you just uploaded a few days ago, your own audio recording of reading the whole short story. So listeners, if you haven't had a chance to read the short story, maybe now is a good time to pause and go back and look for that audio version to listen to. It shouldn't take super long. It's a relatively short story, short story, I guess I should say. But here we are in what, Brian, I think we would call weird fiction is what Blackwood is typically talked about as. And so the Kit Bag here, as we mentioned in the cold open, is maybe more of an Advent story or a wintry story or like a St. Nicholas Day type story with the sack and the murderer that might be in the sack, might not be in the sack, who's going after our protagonist here. You suggested this story. I'm familiar with Blackwood, not this story in particular, but it made sense to fit with this episode today. So I'm going to turn it over to you to start. What are the themes and elements you're seeing in Kit Bag to make it a appropriate story for our Christmas Horror Joy episode?
Yeah, so like you said, I uploaded an audio version of Kit Bag. Please give me some grace, as it were, for my performance. Did some voices, so hope you enjoy that. But yeah, listen to it if you have a chance. If you haven't listened to or read the story, it is a quick one, like you said, Jeff. One, I think I wanted an excuse to talk about Blackwood. Blackwood has been a favorite author of mine for a long time. We have a pet fish whose name is Algernon. It's like Algernon, bubbleface, cloudfish, something or other. I don't know what it is, but first name is Algernon, named after Algernon Blackwood. Yeah, so looking for an excuse. He has a few stories about the winter. Glamour of the Snow is fairly well known. He is known as a weird fiction author, probably most famous for The Willows, which is a fantastic weird fiction story. If you are looking to get into weird fiction, that is one that can get you in, I think, fairly easily, and it's just a good story. He has a lot of stories, writing these kind of delightful horror, ghost, weird stories. I think this is a kind of ghost story, but the thing that draws me in is that this feels like a kind of horrific telling of something like Santa Claus. There's this anticipation of a vacation. So I know, right, we're professors, we're looking for the end of the semester. I've got kids, we're looking for a little vacation. We're anticipating. The idea that we anticipate some break, I think, is important. Advent in the Christian calendar, right, is the season before Christmas. So you start to anticipate, you do all these things, you have an advent calendar. Lots of people know this. But I think that this story fits there. It's like an advent story where we're anticipating. And Blackwood is really good at setting up the kind of horror and the kind of creepiness of anticipation. We get this kind of junior barrister, right? He's a lawyer kind of guy after this difficult and, I don't know, gruesome kind of trial. He's looking to go on vacation. His boss sends him a bag so he can pack up and head out. And the bag has this very sinister kind of role in the story. It kind of follows him around. Does it bring with it tidings of joy? Or does it bring something a little less savory? So I think there's something really kind of interesting there. The sense in which the anticipation goes awry. It sets us up to like want something good, but that's always kind of pulled back from us. And I think that the kind of atmosphere that Blackwood creates is really, really kind of incredible. But this kind of haunted sack, as it were, I think is also a good story for us. I've got a few other things to say, but I wanted to throw it back to you, Jeff, to see if you had any initial thoughts on the kit bag, what you think is going on here, what this does, just kind of narratively. It's like a nice kind of cozy short story. There's some moments when it gets a little creepy. I liked it a lot. Again, the atmosphere is really good. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate Blackwood's the narrative perspective he gives us. This is, I would call it probably a third person limited, where we are seeing things through Blackwood's or our main character's perspective, not Blackwood, excuse me. Johnson is our main character's name, I want to say. Yes, that's right. There are times where I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think most folks in their lives at some point have been in this character situation where you're in a room and something feels kind of creepy and you're not really sure what to make of it. You think it's your mind playing tricks on you because you're overtired, because you're overworked, because you're hungry, any of these things. It's eerie to read because you anticipate, as you said, something is going to happen. It's just a matter of what it is. And then the ending, I think, is great. Like the ending where it turns out that, oh yes, this person who was being tried for murder killed himself just at a certain timestamp last night. And in that way, it kind of reminds me of some of the scary stories to tell in the dark that we talked about a few episodes back, where this is quintessentially in the form of the ghost story. It is something that you would tell to each other. It's short enough that it isn't going to take too long, but also this one in this case is long enough where it builds up enough backstory and enough foundational setting to make you able to inhabit the world that Johnson's in here. You can almost picture like the room he's in, and it feels very much like turn of the century, because we talked about before the show, Blackwood's writing this, publishes this in 1908, so we're early 20th century at this point. Feels a lot like Poe to me, something that my students love, Edgar Allan Poe, so I get to hear a lot about Poe. I myself am kind of ambivalent on Poe. I would take Blackwood over Poe. I don't know what that means about me or says about me, but it also, I mean, despite the fact that you anticipate the ending coming, to me, the ending also is a bit like it wraps up relatively quickly, where as soon as the specter of haunting or ghosts arrives, it's gone. It's undone. And I think that's, Brian, you're probably more of an expert in weird fiction than I am, but to me, this is a hallmark of weird fiction, where the weirdness often goes as fast as it arrived. And that's, in a way, how weird fiction plays into that bigger genre of what we might call magical realism, where you can see the fantastic or the supernatural existing side by side with the mundane and the everyday. Again, going back to things we've talked about in previous episodes, I love this sort of fiction. This is what I live for. I love fiction that makes us think about what is possible rather than what is logical. And this surely does that. So, and the fact that, yeah, we can think about the sack that he's using, the kit bag, as perhaps a representation of the sack that St. Nicholas would carry around. And then to really think about how Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, jolly old St. Nick, the big man in red, is really a home invader. Like, it's home invasion, what he's doing. So in many ways, like that's not that much less creepy than what's happening here in the kit bag.
Yeah, I like a lot what you're saying. So setting up this idea of weird fiction, you're right. It feels like it's horror meets wonder in many ways. And this balance between the two, it really never swings one way or the other between those two kind of poles. And I think Blackwood does this really well. And so, like you're saying, the specter, the ghost shows up and then it's gone. And we're left thinking, like, oh, the ghost, that was scary and it left really quickly. But then we also have to now reckon with this fact that we heard about a murderer who seemed to have gotten off, right? He was found not guilty or whatever, didn't get sent to jail partly because of Johnson's work. That's partly horrific, right? It seems like him and Mr. Ibrahim or whatever the barrister's name is knows that this guy, John Turk, was a murderer. He did it. And they helped him to get away with it. That's horrifying. And then he kills himself. That's also horrifying. So there's something very heavy about it. There's also a clear and very interesting and compelling description of horror, I think, that happens in the text itself. So Blackwood kind of says, like, when does the kind of switch of fear really take over? And then when do we kind of ratchet that up in different phases? And then once that happens, what can we say about our perceptions of the things that are happening to us? So one person that I really like reading is somebody named Michael Sisko. He writes weird fiction, lots of horror, weird horror fiction, really good author, but wrote a genre study on the weird, and it's great. I talked about it in my book, but he talks about the weird fiction as setting up a departure from the familiar. So more than anything else, weird fiction takes us to a point where we have to depart our world in some way. And that balance of wonder and what's possible rather than what's logical and what's on the other side, it's not a claim about what's on the other side. It's just a setting you up as a reader to be like, wow, there's something else here. That's weird. There are these great images too throughout the story where he first kind of sees the kit bag, right, which is like a suitcase sack kind of thing. And he sees it. And like you're saying, I've had these experiences where you're home alone and you know you're alone. He knows that the room below him is empty. He knows it. So every noise has to be explained. If you're in a house with somebody else, or if you know that there's going to be noises elsewhere, it's easy to explain those away. But if you know that you're alone, I went to see a Heretic all by myself. And there are times when, like, I kept hearing noises. And I was like, I know that I'm the only one in here. How can I explain these noises? What's going on? It frightened me. And I think that that's what happens here is, in a sense, he frightens himself because he's alone. He hears these noises. And is it the case that he's seeing this stuff for real? Is it the case that his fear kind of takes over? Or is it the case that he's having some kind of delusions or hallucinations? I think that's unclear. And that's part of the whole weird fiction thing. Yeah, Jeff, what do you think?
Absolutely. And then just like to go back for a second, if you were in the auditorium alone watching Heretic, you weren't actually alone because, as we all know, if it's an AMC, Nicole Kidman is somewhere with you, trapped inside of that auditorium because magic feels real in a place like this, or whatever the line is. AMC, we here at Horror Joy are still looking for sponsors. And I mean, what could it hurt? You're already a failing business at this point. Just come along with us for this journey. But you're absolutely right. Like, I live in an old house and it makes noises all the time. And without getting too ghost huntery on us here, I've been places and I've lived places where you can feel like there's a presence, if you will. There's something that's a little bit like off about it. I've been very lucky. The homes I've lived in never had that issue. I've been places that remind me of that, stayed places like hotels. This place, not like that. Very warm, nice, all of it. Basements are always creepy. I'm sorry, they just are. I've never been in a basement that I'm like, yeah, this is a great place. I like to stay here for a while. No, creepy as fuck. Don't want to be there. So, but like, there's noises, and I'm like, oh, it's, to me, since I have cats, I'm always like, oh, it's the cats. Like, I explain these things away by saying it's the cat, and I feel like, in a story like Blackwood's here, if our character Johnson had a dog or a cat, he would say, oh, it's probably the cat. And he would look next to him and see that the dog or cat was right there sleeping. And they'd be like, oh, no, it wasn't. I want to read this one description. And I know you already did for the audio recording you did, but there's this paragraph to me. It's just great. So very softly and stealthily, his hand groped behind him for the handle of the door. Before he could actually turn it, the very thing that he most of all dreaded came about. And John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him. At the same moment, that heavy sigh passed through the air of the room, formulated somehow into words. It's my bag and I want it. Johnson just remembered clawing the door open and then falling in a heap upon the floor of the landing as he tried frantically to make his way into the front room. So I think we've all been there, opening a door. And like, I think what Blackwood gets really right in a lot of his work, but in this story, in that very paragraph, is a lot of horror and a lot of fear is anticipation, which is to say, waiting for the thing itself to happen. Think about when you're watching a horror movie. A lot of the time we know what's going to happen or we assume what's going to happen. So the fear you have is waiting for it to be revealed rather than after you've seen it. There's something almost freeing about the event itself that releases you from the horror. Now, it might release you from one sort of horror into another worse horror, but sometimes you see this in horror movies all the time where they play upon our expectations, and or in horror books too, or any sort of horror media, video games as well. They play upon our expectations. And when expectations are met, that can provide horror. Or if they're not met, that can be more unsettling sometimes. Sometimes seeing if the devil actually there could be a relief compared to wondering what exactly is here. And that's kind of, I think, what Blackwood's doing. Like, I don't think Johnson's actually seeing these things. I think he thinks he's seeing these things. And so it's a psychological type of horror at that regard too. Again, we've talked before how horror is a genre that requires belief. If you don't have the creative capacity or maybe the overactive imagination to invent belief in things, horror might not be a genre that resonates well with you or might not work well on you because you don't have the imagination that it could be something, rather that it's cold and logical explanations for everything, unless you're in the movie Alien. So go back a few episodes for that. But yeah, here we have what he thinks he's seeing. We could psychoanalyze to say, oh yes, well, you just worked this case. This is why you're seeing these things. But it's very real for Johnson in this moment. And the fact that the sack too is an exterior that holds things, a container, then you can't see what's in it is the other part. And again, it's the same thing like being on the other side of a door. You don't know what's there. And until you open it, the sack or the door, you either have your suspicions confirmed or they are denied in that way. So Brian sort of went in a little bit of a rambling rant there. So things to go with Blackwood.
No, I think that's really good, because right before the description that you read, there's like this tension where he's like, do I really want to turn on the light? There's a moment where he thinks, I don't know if I really want to see what's there or not. And I think like what you're saying about the sack, about anticipation, I think is captured right there in that kind of, do I want to see it? Yes, I do, but maybe I don't. I'm worried about what I'm going to see, but I'm scared about not seeing it. The end of the story really brings that to full tension to like an embodied feeling as a reader. And I think that Blackwood sets up the atmosphere in a way that's compelling. And for me, jump scares, I'm fine with them if they're good or well placed. But if they're the whole thing, for me, that's a failing of a horror movie. And I think it's much more difficult to establish an atmosphere that generates these kinds of anticipations and the fulfillment of those anticipations. And I think that's really important. So maybe we should switch over to Black Christmas. Don't want to switch over too soon. You have anything final to say about the kit bag before we head over to Black Christmas?
I mean, again, I just think it's a really great little story for the time of the year. It has that feel of just a cold, wintry story. Again, I'll just echo what I said about it reminds me a lot of maybe a more adult version of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And just the way, the rapidity with which it ends, I think is characteristic of weird fiction in a really good way. So again, Brian did a recording of this. If you haven't had time to listen to it, make some time over the holidays. Hopefully you in your commute, while you're out for a run, while you're walking and trying to ward off seasonal affect disorder and or existential dread. These are good times to listen to a story like this.
Yeah, I love it. I think the final thing I'll say, right, is I just remembered this. There's so for me, I don't really care that much whether or not he's seeing them or not. Like, I can balance between those two things. It's like a superposition, right? And it never feels actually collapsed for me, as if I have to choose one or the other. And I really like that about that. But I think to kind of read into the psychological reading, there is a line from his boss where his boss is like, forget these images. They're going to come back to you at a time when you least expect it. And it's going to be unfortunate for you. And that's exactly what happens, right? So we can clearly say like, oh, he's just experiencing fear. based on all the stuff that just happened in the trial, and we can explain it away, or maybe it's really happening. But I think that line is never really crossed, and it never really gets collapsed. It's left open, which, like you said, is very, very weird fiction. All right, let's head to Black Christmas. This is 1974. We're setting up the slasher genre in many ways. So Bob Clark is the director. There's been 2 remakes of this. I don't know if you've seen them, Jeff. If we want to talk about them at all, I'm happy to leave them out. The 2003 version, I did not like at all. The more recent one was okay, but Black Christmas, 1974, it's pretty good. I mean, some things that it sets up for us, as we talked about in the cold open, is this is a sorority. So the victims are mostly young women. So we can talk about the vulnerability of these young women, what it means to be targeting them. We get the first person shot. So we get the kind of view of the killer from the beginning, which is, of course, something we see throughout the early slasher days, from Halloween to Friday the 13th and so on. And so we're kind of thrust into this position of seeing what the killer is seeing. I think that's important. We have all these kind of lonely characters along the way. What do we make of Mrs. Mack and the Margot, the drunk sorority sister, and whether or not the police are going to listen to the women, right? I think there's a lot to say about Black Christmas. There's a great scene with the carolers coming to the door. There's something interesting about the way that the audio works in this movie. But Jeff, I want to hear your first takes on Black Christmas. Have you seen it before? And what'd you think about this rewatch?
Yes, this is my first time watching it. I was aware of it. Like I've known about this movie for a long time, but I've never actually watched it. I thought I had until we sat down to watch it. And when I did watch it, I was like, oh no, I've never actually seen this before. But it has these elements of the 70s that are so like that carpet, man. Like I can feel that orange carpet. Like I can feel walking on it. I can smell the cigarette smoke lingering in those rooms. All of these decorations in there that are probably that really fake smelling plastic from the 70s. They're set up for Christmas in that way. It's something you mentioned before we started recording, where there's not a ton of Christmassy about this movie, frankly, other than it's set at Christmas and the carolers. But the alcoholic house mother who's taking care of them, Mrs. Mack, as you said, who has a bottle of not port, sherry. She has sherry hidden all throughout, like different places in a Bible at one point, or in a book somewhere, in closets, in the tank of the toilet. She's just constantly finding this stuff and drinking it, and her makeup's all kind of smeared. It's a strange aesthetic in some ways. You have Barb, who is the mouthy sort of like new second wave feminist woman in this film. She's an independent woman. She's not going to take shit from anyone. She's drinking, she's chain smoking cigarettes, she's mouthing off to the police, telling them that their phone number is fellatio something. And this is actually something that I think might be worth talking about for us. The way in which the police are parodied or satired in this film, like it's just being completely inept and unable to find killers or save anyone. There's the random young girl that is murdered in the park, who has been missing, and the mother's in there when the sorority girls come in to say, hey, we have missing sorority sisters. There's all different types presented in the different sorority sisters that we get. It almost reminds me of Cabin in the Woods, how we looked at some types back there for that more than a few episodes back now. But it's the thing that resonates with me about this movie, thinking about the first person perspective we get from the killer, is back to what we talked about with Halloween, with Michael Myers as a child looking through the clown mask as he murders his sister. There's something about these slasher films wanting us to inhabit, if for only brief moments, the perspective of the killer. Don't get the killer's perspective. We get it a lot early on, and maybe not as much later on in Black Christmas. But then we see like just the eye of the killer peeking through like a doorway. He has an interesting decorating sense where after he kills some of the girls in the one scene, he puts them in an awkward pose. So, and it seems there's some trauma unresolved for the killer here. And that's something that's, I think, common to all of these slasher films. There's an unresolved trauma. Maybe other than Michael Myers, he's the only one that just seems to be, as Loomis would say, like, evil incarnate or something. All these other slashers have had something bad happen to them that leads them to this. So here, we don't know what it is, but we hear the slasher talking almost a schizophrenic type way with different voices, that he's reliving something from his past, whether it's his childhood or what, it's not clear. You would almost expect, right, for this movie, given that it's focused on a sorority house, that there'd be some more backstory about why he's at the sorority house. Was he somehow like a jaded lover? Was he a student that was turned aside or kicked out or like just rejected or just a loner? And we don't get any of that. Like, it's just that this guy randomly finds his way into a sorority house and hides in the attic for a bit before one by one killing the sisters who live there. There is the strange, and maybe it's simply to set up the red herring of the Peter character who is dating Jess. Yeah. And like is apparently at the school trying to get a music degree of some sort and not doing so well. So maybe that's why we're supposed to, why he's there. Maybe this is to lead us down the wrong path to make us think it's him. But at the end, sorry, spoiler alert, turns out it's not him. It's not Peter. Yeah. Like there's a lot of questionable decisions made where the police never decide to check the whole house after someone's missing or after someone's been found murdered. They just assume that, oh yeah, there's an attic. That's nice. Oh yeah, there's a basement. Well, we all have basements. The guy that's left out front to guard the house at one point just gets like his throat slit, which it's completely left unexplained in the movie. At no point do we see the killer going outside. We just at some point look outside and the police car, the guy sitting there has had his throat slashed and is doing no good. So there's maybe something to be said there about observations. There's perhaps we could get into some Foucault, not that we want to, but we could talk about how the idea that there's the fear of observation or the fear of being watched, but also for if you're the people in the house, maybe there's this comfort in thinking that you're actually being protected by a police officer waiting outside your house. In reality, it didn't seem to make much difference. So I'm curious, Brian, sort of where you see this fitting perhaps in the larger genre of slasher films, because we did talk about it in the cold open, but also how you understand this killer, unnamed as far as I know, compared to say someone like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees' mom, then Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, etc.
I think a few things you said are really interesting. One is that we seem to be embodying the killer at the very beginning, right? So there's opening scene and the killer seems to be on the outside. We're peering in. There's something about this that for me reads as loneliness. There's lonely characters in this film, and it feels as though there's something there at the holiday. There's this kind of feeling where loneliness is enhanced or it's amplified. And so in this rewatch for me, there was something very lonely about it. You look into other people having a party and having fun, and you're on the outside. And this sets up this inside-outside distinction that we've talked about a lot before. I do think Mrs. Mack is lonely. She's drunk. She tries to get a ride from Mr. Harrison. You know, really, I think she just wants more booze, but maybe she's trying to flirt. It's unclear. I called her Margot because it's played by Margot Kidder, but Barb seems lonely. She gets a call that her mom is not going to be around for Christmas. She's going to stay there. And so there's this kind of feeling of loneliness that we maybe embody at the very beginning. In terms of the kind of slasher genre, I think what's interesting here is that we don't really ever see the killer. We see a kind of shot of their eyes, and then we get that shot of Peter in the window when Jess is in the basement. And I think there's a chance that the audience is like, yeah, that's the same killer. We never see his face. That's the same killer. What we do get is a voice. And I think the voice over the phone is really important. Instead of seeing, we hear. And so more than I think being watched, it's like this weird sense in which the phone is holding them hostage. They have to be by it. They are called to it. And of course, the call is coming from inside the house. And so there's something about I think the phone and the voice that's really important here. I read an article called Body Telephone Voice, Black Christmas and Monstrous Cinema. Morton Thompson, there's a couple of things here that I think are really interesting. So he says, at its most basic, the purpose of the motif, that is of the phone, is simply to create suspense by setting the stage for an unknown, often unknown and potentially dangerous individual lurking somewhere outside the frame of the cinematic image. So here we have cinema, it's showing you something, and the fear and the danger is supposed to be in the image. But here, the killer remains off screen. We don't really ever see it. It never collapses for us, maybe like the kit bag. Thompson goes on to say, in the 1974 Canadian teen slasher Black Christmas, the motif also reflects anxieties concerning the possible erosion of established categories of knowledge and identity, particularly as it relates to a range of overlapping and ideologically charged dualisms dominant in Western culture: self-other, male-female, human-machine, reality illusion. So there's these pictures where we get this rocking chair, right? So Claire, I think, is the first person to die. Who's the first person to die? Is it Claire? Yeah.
Yep.
So Claire dies, and she's set up in the rocking chair. This reminds me, along with the voice that the killer is doing, is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it a child? Psycho, right? So there's this tension of these dualisms at play here that gets expressed through the voice. And I think that there's something interesting about that. So the telephone sets up the clear connection with other things, like in Halloween. We talked about this in our episode. The telephone rings and it feels like a harbinger of doom. Scream, of course, has that telephone, especially at the very beginning. What's your favorite scary movie, right? All that stuff. So I think that there's a clear line from Black Christmas through Halloween, all the way to Scream and so on, that we have here. A couple things I want to say, and I want to hear your response to this too, is it's interesting to me that when the sorority women go to the police and say, hey, we've been getting these calls and we can't find this person, they don't listen. They take the phone number, and that's the fellatio joke. It's only when Mr. Harrison and Claire's boyfriend go back to the police that they start the search. Oh, the men are saying that there's something wrong? Yeah, let's go see if there's something wrong, right? I think that's something that's on display. The satirization of the police as inept, but also as sexist. I think that the mental illness aspect of it is really strange to me. I don't know. You're right. We never get anything about the killer. The backstory of the killer is not clear. But there is a point where it feels as though what he's doing is repeating things that he's heard. Right? At one point, he repeats to Jess things that she said to Peter, or Peter said to her. And so I think that there's something there where he has been observing and now repeating all of the things. And so maybe this is the horror of the secret conversation, the horror of the things shared in intimacy that shouldn't be revealed to everybody else, that is now being revealed by this unknown and unseen person on the outside. And I'm gonna throw this to you here. I'm sorry for this. There's an interesting storyline here with Peter and Jess and abortion, and I'm not sure exactly what to do with it. There's certainly a kind of sexist read of Peter, and of course this sets up the red herring that Peter is in fact maybe the killer, because he says things about you can't hurt the baby. But I don't know. What do you think about the abortion storyline in here? Is it important? Is it, what's going on there? What do you think?
Yeah, in some ways, this movie is just all over the place. Like it's trying to do a lot of things, and it does some of them well and a lot of them not well. We just watched Rosemary's Baby for the first time before watching this movie, like a couple days or a week or so later, or whatever. And so the idea of abortion was on my mind, and the idea of, men trying to tell women what they can and can't do with their bodies, and how that in and of itself is a sort of horror, was on my mind. We just talked about Alien not that long ago, with how the shoe is completely on the other foot, so to speak. If it's a man who is being impregnated by an alien, and that's at that point, oh, it's fine. Let him walk about. It'll be fine. He can make his own decisions. But women don't get that. Part of me thinks it's to make Peter the villain in 1974. Given, again, it's a Canadian movie, right? Like this is so I don't always want to assume that Canadian politics are slightly better than American politics, or maybe more progressive is the way I should phrase that. But I think that they likely are. So we're in a post Roe v. Wade era. We are, again, like I was joking about calling Barb a second wave feminist, but we are right in the very middle of second wave feminism as a movement in the United States at this point. So to have Jess then, who is a little more likable than Barb because she's probably less lonely than Barb. I think that was really well put, thinking about how this film's a lot about loneliness, especially Barb, who seems just so lonely. Nothing behind the eyes at times. Like the acting's great because she looks that level of drunk where like we've all seen someone that drunk where there's just not anything registering behind the eyes. I think it is meant to forward the red herring, the pregnancy narrative here. Don't think that it really mattered much beyond that because it's not addressed at all after Peter's killed. So when Jess is our final girl, right? No one talks about the baby. No one mentions that she's pregnant. Is it that no one knows? Is she the only one who knows and therefore they don't know? Like it's not clear that they even gave her a medical examination after all of this happens. She's just put in a bed in the house that she was nearly killed in. They're like, yeah, this is perfectly safe. Wait here. We're a very small town and don't have a hospital for you to go to. So hang out here. And then, oh, wait, Mr. Harrison fainted. We're going to get him to the hospital. But you, Jess, you stay right here and just wait. It'll be fine. What could possibly go wrong? So yeah, the narrative around the pregnancy, it made me did wonder if there's some nod to abortion rights here. But again, it's used very clumsily. Like I don't think it's actually used effectively insofar as making a statement about abortion or reproductivity rights or women's rights over their own bodies or anything like that. Because like this whole movie seems to be at its core a slasher that is just looking to violate women's bodies as much as possible and then to put them, again, like I mentioned earlier, in this strange feng shui dressing or like pose situation in the one scene with, I think it's Phil and Barb, who are in the bed, or in Barb's bed, put in that strange statue-like way. The phone thing you brought up too, if I might go back to that, I'm so happy you brought that up because I was thinking about this while watching it. The constant grating ringing of the phone that we talked about with Halloween is present here again too. And there is something about a telephone that makes a threat very real and very present, but also distant at the same time. And so the article you brought up is really interesting. But this makes me want to go back to, again, Kristeva and the abject and how this is one of those key concepts that motivates or animates so much horror, which is to say the thing itself, there's the separation between subject and object. That's the base definition of abject, right? The phone allows that. The phone allows this separation between the person who is making the call and the person who's answering the phone. But the way in which you mentioned how the phone becomes, it's almost like a chain, like a ball and chain, or like they're somehow tethered to it, especially towards the end when they're trying to trace the call to figure out where the call's coming from. Jess is instructed by the police sergeant to remain on the phone as long as possible because it's going to take a while to track this person. So like, again, we don't really know what's wrong with this killer. We assume it's some type of, I said schizophrenia earlier, but maybe it's multiple personality disorder. At times, the way that they're talking reminds me of James McAvoy's character from M. Night Shyamalan's Split, where you have like the really high voice and acting like, but he's also being lewd in the sense that he's making sexual noises. So the police write it off as being some crank call from some horny undergraduate who's calling the women's sorority house and getting a good laugh about making sexual noises. But we saw that in Halloween too. So like maybe we're all just too far removed from crank calls because we all have essentially caller ID on our phones now with our cell service, but you can't get away with just calling someone and being a jerk. So Jess's situation with being pregnant and telling Peter she doesn't want the baby and Peter being like, but you have to keep the baby. That totally trying to make Peter seem as a suspect. The phone though, I mean, that I think is just an element they're using and it gets carried through horror, like you mentioned too. I want to finally though come back to this idea of loneliness that you brought up, because I think that's why at times this movie is hard to connect to some of the characters. The only character who I connect with in this film is Jess. We get her most frequently, but she seems to be the most fully fleshed out character. And again, in some ways, like for just reasons, like she's pregnant for reasons. There's not really like a good argument or an exemplum to be made here. It's just like she's pregnant and she told Peter, no, she's still not keeping the baby. And then, well, we got rid of that after Peter's dead. Barb is kind of like a low-key alcoholic. We all knew those people in undergraduate. Peter's a failed pianist. Phil seems nice enough. I think she's like maybe the president of the sorority, or she seems to be someone in a position of authority. Claire's like the young version who also has interesting posters on her walls that her dad's not thrilled about. I think Claire's purpose is to bring Mr. Harrison into our lives, who we didn't need him. He could have stayed home, but now he's hanging out at the sorority house. So the loneliness, it's happening with the characters in the sorority house, but you get the sense of it too from the mother who has lost her child. And that's one of the, to my mind, watching this, that was one of the more tragic parts of this entire movie. I don't know if I want to say it's horrific. Her discussion of her husband being away, and it's her and her daughter, and they were trying to find him something for Christmas. So they were going to find him something for Christmas, and she just didn't come home from school. And that's, I mean, I'm not a parent, so I can't speak to that, but I think that is probably a real horror that parents play through their heads for a number of reasons, given that, I don't know, in 2024, we have school shootings pretty much once a week at this point. I don't know what the statistics are. I haven't looked at them. It's too depressing to think about, but that's an ongoing issue. She's lonely. The police officers are just a parody. I don't really know if there's too much to be looking into them. Every character in the sorority is lonely. Mrs. Mack, super lonely. Like you don't keep that much alcohol around the house just to be drinking if you're in a good mood. And like you said, she's trying to, I think she's supposed to go home to visit her sister. And it's like the first time she's been going anywhere for Christmas. Barb's disappointment at being abandoned for Christmas again. And this is maybe something that not so much a horror motif, but we see this in a lot of school movies where like kids are left at home or sorry, left at school over the holidays, whether it's something like Harry Potter or even The Holdovers from a couple years ago with Paul Giamatti. So yeah, like loneliness and how loneliness makes room or makes us maybe vulnerable to horror just because there's no one else around. It's not even a matter of you making yourself vulnerable to it by playing with a Ouija board or something. It's just that literally you are alone and there's no one around you to help you or to help you make sense of what's happening. And there's another connection too. I think you brought this up perhaps, but to Kitbag, where Johnson is alone. And so in that being alone, in that state of loneliness, being tired, being overwrought, overworked, there is this ability that where you are vulnerable, both literally, but also emotionally and spiritually. And yeah, I don't know if anything I said there made sense, Brian, but I'm liking this concept of loneliness.
Yeah, I think one thing that you brought up at the end too is this idea of vulnerability. And I think this is maybe one of the last things that I want to say really is that it feels as though the sorority setting is picked in part because these women are taken as vulnerable. And in many ways they are, right? Who's in charge of them but Mrs. Mack, who's a bumbling alcoholic? She doesn't really give them the kind of care and certainly not any kind of quote unquote protection from anybody else. So they are, I think, a vulnerable group of people. And you see this as even at the very end when Jess is left at the house. Like you're right. They're like, oh, Mr. Harris is fainted. Let's take him to the hospital. We're just going to leave Jess at the house. That's it. We haven't done a full sweep of the house. We're just going to leave her here completely vulnerable because she is asleep. Like we have drugged her and now she's asleep in her bed. And she's made as vulnerable as possible. And I think in part, this setting up of the final girl, right? Jess is the final girl here. But like you said earlier, it's a messy slasher film because there's not a lot of precedent for this film. There are no rules for slasher films. And I think that this actually gets us to Laurie Strode or gets us to other famous final girls because her vulnerability never turns into this strength, right? She's not necessarily resourceful. It's not as if she's like clearly somebody who can take care of herself, other than the fact that she resists Peter. She says, Peter, I'm pregnant and I want to have an abortion. And he's upset about this. He's like, I want to talk about it. And she resists that, right? She shows a kind of strength here. So yeah, the vulnerability part of it, I think, sets up other aspects of slashers, especially when we think that one person is vulnerable and in fact they're not. They are strong and resourceful and smart and tactful and all those things that can allow themselves to be the final girl. I also think that there's an argument to be made that all of the terrible male characters in this are setting this up as a kind of feminist punchline. The call's coming from inside the house, right? Who is the actual danger? Is it your boyfriend? right? Is it your dad? Is it the police who won't believe in you, or the police who won't believe what you say and will leave you as vulnerable as possible when all is said and done because they think they've done enough to protect you? I mean, they know that they're going to be tracking or tracing the phone calls, but nobody's in the house with Jess, right? They're like, yeah, if you get a phone call again, just no problem. Let us know. We'll be listening to it at the station. It's cool. And I think that there's a sense in which at the end, the call is coming from inside the house, is this sense in which everybody that you thought was quote unquote protecting you is not. Everybody who you thought was helping you to be safe is endangering you. And therefore, the development of the final girl is this very resourceful, very strong, very capable female character. Laurie Strode or Ripley are two that we've talked about recently who do all of these things. And I think there's this kind of beginning argument for why we need the final girl in this movie. I think these two kind of things going on here where we get vulnerability as one, and that sets up maybe men as a potential endangering mechanism that requires the final girl. So this is the logic by which the slasher film, the final girl, is going to get set up historically in horror cinema. And I don't know, it feels messy. It feels all over the place, but there's also something I think embedded in here that leads us down the road that, that people love. We love these kinds of movies. And I think that Black Christmas in part gets us set up for why we love these movies. So Jeff, what do you think? Final thoughts on Black Christmas and some joy. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm wondering when you're talking about Final Girl, how Black Christmas gives us the final girl of Jess in this case. I'm wondering about what do we do with the fact that our final girl in this case is pregnant? And is that in maybe some way a foil to what we see with Jamie Lee Curtis's character in Halloween? Why am I blanking on her name?
Laurie Strode.
Laurie Strode, thank you. Who is virginal, pure from all outward appearances anyway, and all of her friends make fun of her for this, so it would seem to be the case. Jess is not that final girl. She's a very different type of final girl. She's left alone and isolated. I wonder if that's punishment in a way. The more I sit here and think with this, if somehow the movie is punishing her for having a child out of wedlock, if it is, that maybe more misogynist backlash towards a feminist reading of this play, or a misogynist writing, I guess, that is making fun of feminism in this movie. So seeing her as final girl as compared to Laurie Strode, just noting the differences there. Also wondering if in some ways this is too on the nose, but the fact that she's pregnant at the end of this movie and is our final girl is also a way of ensuring sequels. The idea that, we are going to make more of these in the future, and we are going to find a way to come back to that child that was Jess Bradford's baby in Black Christmas in 1974. And not having seen the remakes, I don't know if they play with that at all. That'd be kind of neat if they did, but I don't think any of them were that smart to do that. And I don't even know if that's a smart thing to say necessarily. But it is curious to see how that works in this movie and to wonder what that means for Final Girl. And, again, we see Laurie Strode, we see other examples going forward. Maybe in this case, the audiences aren't supposed to feel sympathy for a Final Girl and instead are meant to be angry that she's the one that survived, because in this film Claire is likely the purest and she's the one killed first. So did Jess not deserve to survive? Is that somehow how we as the audience are brought into perpetuating the horror in some way? I'm still stuck on the serial killer being somehow vilified because of having mental illness or this association with mental illness and serial killing. I mean, it's not uncommon in actual reality to have that be an association, right? But there does seem to be something, particularly in the 60s and 70s, where we are seeing this portrayal of mentally ill people also being deviants, also being murderers. One wonders if that has to do with, you and I talked briefly before recording, deinstitutionalization that's happening in the United States during this time period, where what would be called state hospitals, which were essentially psychiatric hospitals, are being closed, and folks who have varying levels of mental illness are being streamlined out into the community. I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's a real and present fear that people had. Maybe it's just a response to the slew of serial killers who are around in the 60s and 70s. It's really hard to say. But the important question, where do we find joy in and Black Christmas? Kit Bag is a fun story. I love short stories. I think they're a great genre, or they can be a great genre if the author is good at writing short stories. There are plenty of short stories that aren't good because their author is not gifted short story writer. That's going to be any genre, right? Some people are better at poetry than prose. Same idea. Just a really fun story. It captures the feeling of the anticipation of dread and horror and questioning whether your senses are working and stuff like that. So that's a lot of fun for me. Black Christmas, the joy here is, I think, the ridiculousness of all of it. Like there is some way in which this entire movie is disarmed by laughter, which is to say that you can't take any of it too seriously because it's just so out there and bizarre at times. Mrs. Mack's character is hilarious. I guess I probably should not be laughing at this older than middle-aged woman who is the house mother for the sorority, but her just random stash of sherry around the house, to me, just laughed because I can see this in the 70s. I don't know why, but to me, this makes sense in the 1970s. And just the fact that, they're all just boozing and smoking cigarettes with no second thought. So, Brian, where do you find joy in both Kit Bag and Black Christmas?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about mental illness really quickly. In the sense that I think that in many ways, if something horrific happens in real life, right, if something that is a terrible event happens, we often try to rationalize it by looking at what's outside of our rational limitations, right? We say, what is outside of this kind of scope of rationality? It must be madness. And so if something is unexplainable to us, then we must appeal to madness, that is to say, pure mental illness, as the cause, because any rational being couldn't have done these things, right? And so I think that madness and mental illness end up playing a huge role in these kinds of stories because of that. And I think you can see that in somebody like Nietzsche. We talked about that with Chris Macaulay a little bit, but also with Foucault and the history of madness and all that kind of stuff, right? So all that to say, I think it's probably a scapegoat, right? And that's unfortunate, especially now as we have a better grasp of mental health and mental illness and how that kind of plays out, especially in terms of deviance, etc. So, joy. I mean, just the chance to talk about Algernon Blackwood is joyful for me. Blackwood is somebody that I have been reading for a long time and just has resonated with me on so many levels. I began writing and thinking about something called the eco-weird, and Blackwood was really the kind of first author that took me on that path, which, just to plug the book, I guess, a book is coming out, Eco-Weird. It's an edited volume coming out in February. But Blackwood kind of started me on that path thinking about that stuff. And so the joy of thinking about Blackwood in this very good, I think, I really like this short story, atmospheric, wintry, weathery, snowy, Christmassy, all those things, right? I just love the feeling of what he's giving us in this. And I think you're right. Short stories can be hard because you have less to work with. There's less grace. If you write a 400-page novel and, a few pages of that are not good, that gets just lost in the shuffle. No problem. But if you have a few pages of not good stuff in a short story that's 6, 7, 15 pages, falls apart really, really quickly. And so I think it takes a certain skill to write short stories. So for all of you short story authors out there, kudos to you who do it well. The coziness of Christmas. Man, I love a cozy Christmas story. And to talk about Christmas and horror at the same time, I think it's just so much fun. I think there's so much to say about Black Christmas. A lot of the work we've done here to identify what Black Christmas is doing, as messy as it is, I think it sets us up. It gives us the logic for a lot of slasher films going forward. Finally, I was reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory to my son, and what I like about Black Christmas is that I think it reinforces my intuition that is a slasher book. Like, that book, Willy Wonka is just picking off the kids one by one. That's all he's doing, right? You go through and it's like, oops, sorry, Augustus, down the river you go. Sorry, I gave you this poisonous gum that made you into a blueberry. Oops. Did you fall in the squirrel pit? Oh no. I think Black Christmas reinforces my reading of Willy Wonka or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as a kind of maybe inverted slasher film in some way. But yeah, lots of joy here. I had a ton of fun with this conversation. Jeff, final thoughts on our holiday, mostly Christmas episode here.
Yeah, I mean, just for some lore for your two hosts here, listeners, this now makes me wonder if Brian's trying to catch squirrels with a fishing net is related to his reading of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm not sure. Honestly, if I had to go drowning in a chocolate river, there are worse ways to go. That might not be great, but it can't be bad. Although getting stuck in like the weird bank teller suck up tube, not great. I don't think I want that to happen to me. No, like these were great. I'm just thinking, the last thing I was thinking, because my mind is completely addled at this point of the semester, this point of the show. A lot of folks are recasting movies now with Muppets in mind. So if we were to redo Black Christmas with Muppets, I think the lone Humid, rather, would probably have to be Jess, and everyone else is played by Muppets. So think about that.
Miss Piggy as Mrs. Mac works perfectly, I think.
Absolutely. It'd be great. And Statler and Waldorf, or whatever their names are, they could be the police officers.
Perfect. This is perfect. Yeah. This needs to happen. Whoever is out there taking notes, please make this happen. All right, y'all. I think we are going to be taking a quick break. We'll be back with more episodes in January. But if you're missing Horror Joy, just remember, you can always re-listen to the ones we've already put out there. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to all who celebrate. Wishing you all the horror and all the joy. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.